So, Steve, non-player characters or NPCs, for the uninitiated. What's the big idea? Like, why are we talking about this?
Well, I mean, they're incredibly important because your players or your player character that you're running solo can't be the only thing or the only person that exists in the world.
That's right.
Like, you need other people.
hmm
I don't know if you know this, Matt, but you need other people.
You do. I mean, us being
Yeah.
the Iron Sworn guys with a Z. I'll be working on a logo for that, so we can kind of drop it in
Yes.
every time we mention it. But we do play by ourselves, and as
hmm
much as I wanted to make my lead character in my campaign this kind of like loner who doesn't need anyone, he has slowly accrued a crew of misfits, and kind of other hangers on, because it does make the world more interesting and more real, and ultimately just being on your own would be quite boring, I guess. But NPCs aren't in there just to kind of like provide color or like liven things up, in terms of having some dynamic interactions for your player characters. They serve multiple purposes in game, and as such need to be treated as I guess key mechanical components of whatever game you're playing.
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing for me with creating an NPC is that they have to be, well, they don't have to be,
Mm-hmm.
but it's better if they are memorable.
Mm.
And being memorable can mean a lot of different things. And I think we can all come up with examples of NPCs that we've seen in games that are memorable because they have a funny voice or um, maybe a particularly interesting affect or quirk. But also, NPCs can be memorable because they have importance to the story that's being created at the table. And there are definitely times where you get to the end of a campaign and the NPCs that you interacted with and the ways in which those NPCs fit into the story and really help to build the story and accentuate the story that you were playing at that table, it makes them memorable and an absolutely vital part of the experience.
Mm. If I actually, it's funny you should mention NPCs with silly voices, because as if for science, I recently had my original role playing game group together, who I first started playing role playing games with all the way back 8 years ago. Not I'm a relative newcomer to role playing games, and I asked them, like, we played a lot. We played like 3 whole campaigns of stuff. What is the most memorable NPC that you remember me running? And like they all unanimously said, this character who was in a game we'll talk about later. That it was a game that I ran where essentially all the characters were mutated animals. It's in a kind of a dystopian post-apocalyptic future, and I personally think I made some really great characters for that. Real characters with depth and nuance, I'd say, that didn't kind of fall into clumsy stereotypes, um, or kind of archetypes of people you would meet in any old game. But their most memorable standout character was the one I did the bad South African accent for. It was a rickshaw driver who was also a gazelle, called Blaze, who spoke with a very strong South African accent. And I'm not going to do it now because I will end up having to apologize to not only South Africa, but East Africa, North Africa, and West Africa. And I think maybe the entire Southern Hemisphere, because it's not a good accent. But they think it was funny. That character really did nothing except deliver some exposition. So it was kind of important in a way, but that's the one they remember. And I'm like, guys, seriously, like I put the work in and I made some really good characters, and they're just like, well, we don't really remember the names of any of them, but we remember Blaze. And I'm like, oh god. And that, I think that goes to show that you as a person running a game will always be more attached to your lore and your characters than anyone else will. People will remember what happens, but they won't remember the detail of all that kind of stuff. But what it made me think about when I asked about who is their favorite kind of play NPC. There are characters in that campaign that were my particular favorite NPCs because of where they took the story. So, for instance, my characters picked up a hitchhiker, and I rolled the details up randomly, and that character basically ended up tying like 3 of the main story plots of this entire huge sprawling odyssey together, because I talk about it on my show all the time. We've talked about it when we've done tips videos for Starforged about joining the dots. And there was this, this little character that was just kind of like a weird, eccentric character. It was a gecko, for those who are kind of keeping score of the animals in my game. And when we got to a certain place, I was like, well, he can be dropped off and he can have nothing else, and that'll be it. But we've spent the time getting to know him now. Let's make his dad someone important. And then was like, that's why he was nervous on the journey, because he's a rich kid who's kind of slumming it and has ended up hitchhiking because he's got himself into some trouble. And then all of a sudden, my PCs had turned up in a town they didn't know with the local merchant's errant son. And they suddenly had an inn at a fancy soiree that they could go to. And it was just like, well, okay, that does seem a bit like it is shoehorning things in, but it really isn't. Did it matter that character was connected to the wider story in a way that my PCs didn't know? Absolutely not. And what actually that turned out is that NPC was a random encounter that actually ended up being the catalyst for a huge portion of the story, and it easily could have been forgotten about. And it actually brings me to my next question. Like, at what point do you flesh an NPC out? Because I've got a pretty kind of strict rule that, like, unless they're important, I don't even give them a name, which flies contrary to a lot of advice that we have absorbed in like Apocalypse World, for example, or Dungeon World. Most powered by the Apocalypse games, from which Starforged is based, and a lot of games that we play is based. Say name characters and make them matter, whereas like I think I have to be pretty sure they're going to stick around, because there's been a lot of games that I've run where I've like, do you remember this name? And I say name of person, and they're like, no. And I was like, we met them last session, we did that thing for them, and they're like, no, I don't remember, because it was so inconsequential. So I only really flesh out a character when I know they're going to be important. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, I definitely think that there are tiers of importance, and there are NPCs that are meaningful, and then there are NPCs that are incidental.
Yeah.
And I definitely agree that I don't want to waste effort building out a massive backstory for an NPC that we're going to see once because he's the shopkeeper in the general store in this town that your players are passing through, or your characters are passing through, and we're going to see him once, and then they're never coming back to this town again. They're never going to come across this person again, and if they do, then you can give them a name and details later, because like you were saying with that previous example, a character that was a random generation became such a pivotal part of that campaign. That's the sort of thing that you can't necessarily plan for as a game master. Like that's just something that happens as part of the generative play at the table. And I think pretty much every game master has examples of NPCs that they thought were going to be incredibly important for their campaign, that the characters walked into the room and went the exact opposite direction and never spoke to that NPC. And you're like, but I did all this work to make them interesting and have a backstory. But instead you went to talk to the rickshaw driver who is taking you from one place to another. This NPC that I had delicately planned out had a magic carpet that was going to take you, but no, you wanted to take the road more traveled.
Yeah.
And so I think that you have to, as a game master, be open to and be flexible when it comes to creating your NPCs, knowing that you really shouldn't give them much detail until you know that they are going to be important. And I think this is something that is true of prep in general, and that we kind of have talked about in the past, of like, if you're introducing some plot hooks to your characters, you could sit down and write out the entire length of each of those plots, but ultimately your characters are going to pick one of those
Mhm.
and abandon all the others. If you're lucky, they may pick none of them and then you're just off doing something random, but most likely they're going to pick one of them and the others are going to just fall by the wayside. And I don't know about you, Matt, but I hate preparing stuff that I'm not going to use. It feels like a waste of time, even though I know I can repurpose it for something else in the future. I think that's why I feel so liberated by very minimal prep. And that comes through with NPCs as well. And that's why a lot of the times in my games, I generate NPCs on the fly.
Mhm.
And so, because I'm not looking at creating a vast tableau, I want to make as little as I have to make it believable,
Mhm.
and then build it out from there. Because oftentimes your players will help you fill in details with NPCs. Oftentimes, like we said, they won't remember those NPCs 2 weeks later because it was a passing interaction.
Mhm.
But to kind of like come back to answer your question, I think it is only when that NPC is around for a couple sessions, or if there's something very important that gets attached to that NPC.
Mhm.
So I was just recording a game today and I had my character looking for some information brokers, and I didn't pull out any names for those until I rolled, failed the roll, discovered that the information broker that this character knows is an enemy, and suddenly it's important to know what that character's name is,
Mhm.
because they have now become an obstacle for the character to overcome and not just an incidental interaction to gain information to move the plot forward.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that a key thing for me with NPCs starting off, and it kind of feeds into like when you decide you want to get into more detail with them, is that they have to serve a purpose, and that purpose can be atmosphere or vibe. This character can, turn up and tell us something about the place we've just arrived in by their, they could, let's think of the most overdone cliche in role-playing games. Your characters go into a tavern, and the tone can be set by the first couple of people they meet, even though they're unimportant. The patrons of the Prancing Pony and Brie are not important, but the way they treat our travelers, our hobbits, is very important and tells us a lot about what is going on, what situation the hobbits find themselves in. Those interactions can tell you a lot of things, and you don't have to roll up the names for someone who just comes in and gives a suspicious look or treats someone instantly with discourtesy, because that NPC you've just added, because I mean it's still an extra, right? It's not like a character that's going to interact in any other way other than this kind of very brief way. But you're still making that person up, and the point of that character in this whole long-winded example that I've come up with is that it sets the tone for the scene that's about to play out, and that is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and just leave it at that. You could play that scene out in exactly the same way, and they walk up to the barman, who I think is called Butterman or something like that. He's got like a very kind of silly Lord of the
Barliman.
Rings name. Barliman, that's right, yeah. You know,
Barliman Butterbur.
Barliman Butter. Oh, great name. You know, that could be the point of the whole scene: meeting that person, getting that information, how that person is. Whereas really, he passes on a little bit of exposition. He does his job, and then that's it. We don't really think about him ever again. So I think whenever you bring NPCs into games, either it's a solo game that you're playing, make sure they're doing something. Are they there for the vibe? Are they there to give information? Are they there to, in some way, aid or hinder the PCs? Are they there to tell us something about the world that they're in? Like, there's a lot of games where you are exploring, right? And when you're in any type of media where you've got some characters that do not know where they're going or where they're like the world that they're in, like they need to see someone who lives in that world to learn about it. Like, you find they've reached this uncharted part of the map they've never been to before, and the first NPC they meet has to be someone who lives there, who knows all about it, and can tell us something about the world, because otherwise you're just stumbling around in the dark. So using really kind of interesting, evocative NPCs to flesh out the world that you've built, as talking about world building from last time, is hugely important. They play a massive function. People think that NPCs have to be a connection or someone you end up interacting with all the time, but they can just be about being part of that world and bringing it to life.
Yeah, I agree. And also something that you said just kind of made sense to me, brought something to the forefront of my mind when you said that, like they're just extras. And I think about my show a lot like a TV show.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about it from the standpoint of like, that like the camera pans up and it pans around and like this kind of stuff. And I feel like your player characters are your main actors, the people who have the top billing
Mm-hmm.
in your show. And then the important NPCs, the NPCs that you want to really spend time on building out and fleshing out, those are your, guest stars or your like character actors that are in a 10 episode run. They're in 6 of the episodes, but they're not part of the like main cast.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have your extras, and those are all of the additional NPCs that just need the barest amount of information, because they are just a vibe, or they're just flavor, or they're just there to flesh out the world or provide exposition to propel the characters on to the next plot point. And so in that way, you can kind of create that tier of, all right, so I've got my main cast, I've got my supporting cast, those are the NPCs that I need to spend a little bit of time with, and then I've got my extras, and those are the throwaway NPCs that don't even get a name in the credits.
Mm-hmm.
It's bartender 1 or passerby 3, because you don't need a name.
No.
Because they're just there to fill out the world, and then you can move on. So much of drama and plot movement is created through interaction between characters. And so it's easier when you're playing in a group setting, because the player characters can interact with each other. And I feel like, depending on the game, there's a ratio of like, you have fewer NPCs the more PCs you have in a game, because those players want to talk to each other and not necessarily only talk to the game master.
Mm-hmm.
And so in solo gaming, And I've found this a couple times in some games that I've run where I've had a solitary character. I very quickly was like, I need to find another character to buddy up with, because I'm struggling to tell a story when it's just, and like build a character when it's just this character by themselves with no one to interact with. And like they're interacting with the world, but it's more of a challenge for me to convey that. And like, I could just have them like talk in their head all the time. And ultimately, that's what I did with one of my characters in my Tales of the Burned Stones campaign, like mini campaign, is like he just talks out loud because it's an audio medium, so I had I had to do something. You have to have some way to hear the inner monologue. But with especially with a solo game, creating a good NPC or a couple of good NPCs that your player character can interact with on a regular basis can really be a way to build the tension in the game, to build the world, to push the plot forward, and to make it more fun, because then you can approach different perspectives of a situation without kind of having to have a character who is flopping around to different perspectives.
Yeah. Um, Going back slightly to talking about at what point it's important enough to fill out some details about NPCs. I have a particular NPC in my campaign who goes by the name of Cole Petrov, who is the captain of the crashed peacekeeping mission who Archer runs into on a seemingly abandoned planet. Now, Cole is still in the story and is still contributing to the story, but he has an entire crew with him. And some of the crew stayed behind on the verdant world, whilst Archer and Cole had to come back for them via a magic portal and some flying lizards. We'll get back into that at some point, but that happened. Now, I made the decision quite quickly that I would not name any of the other crew members. That their Cole would in effect speak for the crew and represent the crew, because otherwise it'd be like, well, there's Jenkins the pilot and Jones the medic, and basically it wasn't important to me to spend that much time learning about everyone else. I managed to get across all of the story and character points that I wanted to by just having Cole be the proxy, I guess, for the entire party. And even when they decided to leave and go with Archer and Luna, they took 4 of them with them that were basically passengers on my main character's spaceship for a bunch of adventures. They feature in so many chapters of the story and have never been named, other than, hey, Cole and his crew are there. And it's not important. You get it. And the point is that Cole is the leader of these people. Like, I'm sure I could come up with interesting things that would make them, well-rounded PCs, but it's really not that important for me to have done that. And it's just adding bloat to my story and kind of cast list. So if anyone
that would be a different story.
Exactly.
It would be a different story if you had to name those characters, and it would just be a different experience in general.
Yeah. And the focus of the story at that point was not the others in that party. It was the fact that there were survivors there, and Archer had to speak to at least one of them to find out what was going on, and that became the mouthpiece for the entire crew, and that's it. I think some of them had lines, and they had conflicts and they had internal kind of group dynamics, but we didn't need to get into it. And I think it's because I sat down when I folded them into the story and was like, at this point, what is important? And it's not getting embroiled in the politics of a group of characters that we've only just met. So you mentioned we're going to talk about NPC creation in a couple of ways. We're going to talk about doing it on the fly, and we're going to talk about doing it. We're going to talk about prepping NPCs and prepping the way that I prep, as in not very much. So I'm going to show you some kind of what I've done in the past to kind of try and get the most out of characters by doing as little work possible. So, Steve, when you're making NPCs on your merry travels through one of the 600 episodes of content you put out a week, across 9 different games, and it's all good. How do you do it, Steve? Talk to us about how you go about making characters.
I don't know, man. Just do it.
Yeah, I mean,
No.
here's a question to start you off. Like, how much of it is you've got a good idea for someone and you just do it, or how much of it is you randomly roll it? Because very often I have a strong idea of a character when I'm just starting to talk about them, and I just go with my instinct a lot of the times. I will roll out some details, and I have completely randomly generated some characters in my game. But for you, do you just randomly do it all the time? Do you always kind of go with your gut, or is it a mixture?
I would say it's a mixture, although I think the mixture is weighted a little heavily towards rolling up characters randomly. So I occasionally come across an NPC while I'm playing. And I think one of the differences between what you do and what I do is that you spend a little bit more time on the front end, kind of like playing and prepping your story and like kind of scripting it, or like writing a script based off of your play.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I just turn on the microphone and talk into the microphone until I get to 45 minutes and then I stop, which is terrifying sometimes.
Oh yeah, I
Yeah.
tried. I tried it, and was not a fan.
Yeah. It usually takes me an hour and a half or so, because I do stop in order to think about NPCs, about the direction of the plot, and all these different things. But I would say for the most part, I roll up my NPCs kind of at random using tools in the game, and only a few times have I kind of had an idea for an NPC when that NPC has come up, assuming that that NPC is not a character that I had already planned to introduce into the story, because there have definitely been some NPCs that like I knew existed in the world, but we just hadn't come across them yet.
Yeah.
And so that's a little bit different because that those people I've spent time actually thinking about and creating more mindfully, whereas a lot of the NPCs that I create that are a lot of the incidental NPCs and then NPCs that are important or have become important, I just create on the fly.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd say my general and possibly number one currently principle for creating an NPC, and also just generally gaming and writing and basically anything creative. So this is a very blanket statement, but I think you can drill down on it into each niche that you need to, is to only create as much as you need
Mm-hmm.
to keep playing. And this has become a golden rule for me of like, if you're just starting out, like only build as much of the world as you need to get started. And that looks differently for everybody. And same is true when you're creating an NPC. Some people just need a name and a couple of words. Other people need to sit down and kind of flesh out a little bit of a backstory and get a sense of what the character's like. Some people might need to spend time, practicing voices, and if that's something that's important to them, like that's all of that is valid. The thing to remember is only create as much as you need,
Mm-hmm.
because if you create more than you need, then you're wasting, that's maybe harsh, you're wasting time. I'm going to say it anyways. It may be harsh, but I'm going to say it anyways. You're wasting time that you could spend playing.
Yeah.
And you're oftentimes, I have found in my own life that when I spend too much time creating something, a world, a character, any of those things, it's because I'm afraid to start playing. I'm afraid to continue playing and see where things go, because I don't know where they're going to go, and it's a little scary sometimes.
Yeah.
And so the golden rule here is create just like the barest amount that you need to get started, and then go for it. So I have a list of like things that I would recommend, but
Hmm.
I'll let you respond to my golden rule first, Matt.
Yeah, I mean the good thing is you can add more, right? But
Hmm.
if you go too far and you do a lot, then you're just not using
You,
a lot of stuff, and it's
you can't take it back.
you can't take it back. You can reuse it,
Yeah.
you can repurpose it, and a lot of uh, um, kind of prep and storytelling is reusing stuff that you kind of scrapped or didn't quite get round to kind of using in the way that you wanted to before, and then maybe trying to find a new home for it. But at the same time, you can always start with something, and you can always retcon things if it doesn't if it's not exactly what you want. You can
Yeah.
you can change it. It's not going to be carved into a stone tablet. You're just playing, and I'm personally a huge fan of the. Can we just wind back and retcon? Yeah,
Yeah.
this guy is a blacksmith. Okay, so that's what he does. I know I said he didn't have a job or he was a miner or whatever, but it's actually important that he's a blacksmith now. And if everyone can just forget what I just said, let's move on. And then it tends to work that way. So
Yeah.
tools that you use. You sent me some bits and pieces. Stargazer, which all of anyone who watches this show would know about.
Yeah.
Talk me through how you use Stargazer.
Yeah, so Stargazer is great because it's got all of the Starforged oracles in there, and you can just click on the little dice icon, and it will generate various different things for you on the fly. And so the little thing that I sent for today is what I rolled up for the NPC quick draw in my season 3. And this was a character that I didn't know I was going to need. It was the result of rolling. Uh, it was basically the result of my character getting to a place, meeting a contact, and then realize that contact wasn't ultimately the person that was going to be able to help them,
Mm-hmm.
and that there was another group that person was connected to who was going to be able to help. And so I rolled up that faction first using the oracles in Starforged, and then I was like, all right, now I need someone to represent that faction that my character is going to be directed towards. And so I went in and I chose the role of smuggler
Mm-hmm.
because that was something that fit with that faction that I had created. So I was like, I'm not going to roll on that because I want them to be with that faction, and that faction is a bunch of smugglers, so that's their role. And then I just rolled twice on the disposition, and I got shady and friendly, which is just a wonderful combination
Mm-hmm.
of prompts. And then I don't remember, but I'm pretty sure I came up with quick draw. I don't think I rolled that. Um, but it's possible that I did, in which case that very much informed the character, because then I was like, well, obviously then he's a, gun gunslinger sort of trope, or he's like smoking a cigar and he's got two pistols on his side, and he talks a tough game. But that was it. That was all I created for that character, and he became probably my favorite NPC in that whole season, because even just that very brief snippet was enough for me to build out more of an idea.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great
And then,
example of what you were saying about not creating more than you need. I
yeah,
mean, the thing is, I'm going to say this. Everything that's here, even though it is kind of a minimally sketched out kind of skeleton frame of a character, just the name Quick Draw
yeah,
just does it all. Like, a
yeah,
character called Quick Draw has a lot of story built into 2 syllables,
yeah.
which is very economic. But yes, I like that very much.
I felt like this was cool because I didn't get more information than I needed,
Mm-hmm.
because I just filled in his call signs quick draw, his name, is Quick Draw. I don't know what his actual, birth name is.
Yeah.
Could be Quick Draw for all I know. Maybe his parents were weird, but
Mr. and Mrs. Draw.
yep.
Their son Quick.
Yep. And because I didn't need to know that information. I didn't need to know what his birth name was because that wasn't going to come into play in the story.
Mm-hmm.
And if it had come into play for some reason, if I had been playing and I'd rolled something on, action and theme that was like, friend, danger, I don't know. I might have been like, oh, okay, let me think more about this character and like, why might that character be in danger? Oh, is that character related to somebody else that we've already met? And there you're just spinning off into other avenues. But for this, I just needed a smuggler who is going to help my character get the thing that she needed. And I knew that he was shady because he's a smuggler.
Yep.
And he was friendly. So he was kind of had this very like jovial demeanor when interacting with her, but also being a little bit like, you can trust me. Sure. It's like, can we though? So
yeah, no offense, but I'm not trusting anyone called Quick Draw.
fair.
Yeah. So, like you say, Stargazer uses a lot of the Starforged oracles, which we're looking at now. And the character creation oracles in Starforged, like all of the Starforged oracles, are great in the way that there's enough detail in them, but they're also quite broad. You can roll up some really unusual combinations from this, as I have just had. I know that you haven't listened to my last few episodes, Steve, but I basically had we've just met this big kind of villainous character who is the total opposite, because I rolled up a really mean-sounding name for them, and then when I rolled up the details, it was the total opposite of what that name was, and ended up with a very strange character who now inhabits my story, and I've got to do something with. But it's hopefully a memorable character, and is not just a kind of a common or garden thug that we've seen a million times. And these tools give you the ways to do that, to come up with slightly more interesting things that may be contrary to how you first meet them. And that's why it's great that you have this kind of initial disposition, and then later on you can fill out like observed aspects about their character, and then if you really get into it and go for their character goal and stuff like that, you can very quickly, with 5 dice rolls and not even a sentence of work of detail about these characters, come up with something that gives you a lot to go on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I wanted to showcase this, is that when you're creating an NPC on the fly, like as I am in danger of stating too many times, you don't need that much information. You only need as much as you personally want or feel like you need in order to continue playing.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that when I'm creating an NPC on the fly, I want to get back into the action. I want to make that NPC, and then I want to get back at it so that I can see what happens. I want to see the interaction between that NPC and my character. So I've got a little like list of things you might need when you're creating an NPC on the fly. And this demonstrates some of them. And there are others that aren't on this page, but are on the next page of the oracles. So a name is usually good if they're going to be somebody who needs to be a named character that you're going to interact with. But again, you don't need to create a name. That's why these are all things you might need. I really like creating a goal. Like, what does this person want? Are they with or against the player characters? A description always helps. It could be just 1 to 3 words. And, this is great for really getting a quick snapshot of what the character is like, and their description can be a big part of how they're embodied in the story. And then quirks are always fun too. Just again, 1 to 3 words randomly rolled up, and you can pull all those things together and make an NPC that really, really flows with the story and also is hopefully memorable.
Mm.
And then I think that next one, which is my other kind of favorite tool to go to for creating NPCs, is the Maze Rats random tables. And this is so much fun because there are a lot of the things that we've talked about of like appearance and like personalities, but there's also secrets, which is interesting. There's hobbies, which is kind of a fun one of like that can be just an interesting little snippet into what this character does in their off time that can inform and flesh out the world in an interesting way. And again, like you don't need to roll on a hobby for everyone every single time you roll up an NPC. But I think if it feels right to do so, it can really help to make them feel more real in the world that you're presenting.
This series of tables is really good for if you do want to go that extra step and not have characters perform a kind of like a surface function to your story. And when I say surface function, I don't mean like, it's going to be boring. But what I mean by that is they have a particular job to do and then they kind of get out of the story. If you want to add more, something like these reputations, hobbies, mannerisms are all really good ways to make characters that you folded into the story more memorable. And I've just come back to thinking about when you said that you think about your show like a TV show and you've got your main cast, your series regulars, you've got your main cast, your guest stars and whatever. If I think about this, then okay, I'm making my show as a TV show and TV shows are expensive. I don't want to pay someone to come in and like, if they've only got a couple of lines, I don't want them to build their part up. So, you've got a wage bill that you've got to consider and you've got to think about, could this information or could this thing that needs to happen be told by someone else who already exists in the story, or do I need another NPC to kind of come in and add more to this? Because if you're playing by yourself, these are people you've got to keep track of and you've got to make them memorable enough to distinguish from each other. My first ever Ironsworn campaign is my notebook is just loaded with names and I do not remember anything about any of these players at all, because I rolled up a name for literally everyone. The fishermen that I met, the kind of the beachcombers that I met, they all had names and roles and goals and stuff like that, and they were just I can't handle that much information and fold all of that into my story and make it matter. So they just left the story and now I've wasted time coming up with that and trying to remember it. So if you think about your cast, as it were, if you are going to bring an NPC in to do something, they better be worth the money is what I'd say. If you want to not be subway passenger number 3, you've got to have something about you to. And the thing is, I mean, look at the Soup Nazi, for example, in the popular TV show Seinfeld. That's like a 1-episode character. Everyone remembers him because he's interesting and has something different in that show, which is full of kind of somewhat outlandish characters, has something to be added to the cast and is memorable and has a function and does all these things. Think about it like a TV show, and if you're gonna get your name in the credits, you better earn it, I think is probably a good way to think about it.
Absolutely.
Any other ways about any other tips for making up NPCs on the fly?
I mean, I feel like there are a multitude of ways to sort of create characters, and like doing it this way of rolling on oracles is just one way. And I would say if you have a strong idea for an NPC, like don't even reach for those dice. You don't have to roll on oracle tables. Like trust your instincts. And again, at the risk of being overbearing, like only make what you need to keep going.
Yep.
Because you can generate a really interesting NPC with just a couple of ideas, and then you're back in the story. And I think this is important too. The only way in which that NPC will be important is if they matter to the context of that story. And like, you can come up with cool and interesting quirks and descriptions and all of these different things, but if they never actually are useful to the story and making it more dramatic, making it more engaging, then are those things really worthwhile? Are those quirks, are those backstory pieces worth the time that you spent on them if they're not serving a purpose towards the betterment of the story?
Yeah. And I think a tip that I have for making up NPCs on the fly, and in terms of if you have a fairly decent gut feeling about what you want a character to be, if you find that character slipping into a trope, if you arrive in town and all of a sudden you are meeting the most stereotypical blacksmith you can imagine, who's kind of like a surly, hefty, heavy-set gentleman who's kind of like has no time to speak to outsiders and just wants to carry on with his thing, maybe roll up one thing. Roll up one thing for that character that makes them different to others. And you walk into the blacksmith shop and yeah, they're surly, they don't want to speak to you, you're an outsider, why would they? But let's say you rolled up something like, I don't know, they were immaculately clean. Like, you know, their apron and everything was well kept. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, hang on. Why is that? Oh, is this guy making really high-end weapons? Okay, well, why is he in a town like this? It was like, oh, hang on. Now we've gone down a story rabbit hole again. But like, a little thing can set off more story things, or a little bit of flavor can just make it so it's not just your kind of stereotypical fantasy tropes, which I think is very important.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Should always strive to not just be regurgitating archetypes into your games, because they exist for a reason, because it's a shorthand and people understand what they are. But we can aim for better, can't we? I think
we can.
So prep wise, now I never thought I'd be the person extolling the virtues of prep here, but here we are.
Somebody's got to.
Someone's got to. So I'm going to talk about a game that I talked about at length last time. It's this one. It's Technoir, which again never played. Sounds like a nightmare. If the person who made Technoir is watching, I'm very sorry. It's just too much for my tiny brain to comprehend. But I've used your book so much, and it's been worth every penny that I spent on it. And we talked a lot last time out about the fact that this game uses adjectives, and adjectives in the world building episode we talked about how characters relate to each other, and I showed Steve and I shared the world this diagram, which was from a game I ran, which was a kind of a homebrew campaign, which is kind of loosely based on the After the Bomb setting by Palladium Games in a post-apocalyptic world run with mutated animals, yada yada yada. We've been here before, and these are the characters that lived in the place where my characters ended up, and this is their relationships. But the game actually gives you a preset list of adjectives to apply to characters, and like it says here, it says adjectives are the qualities that make characters stand out. It's not an exhaustive list they give you. It's just, I think it's like 40 adjectives there, and it does encourage you to add your own to this. And I do have somewhere a list of hundreds of adjectives that could apply to people. And I basically picked up this idea and ran with it. When I got to actually making the characters that appear on this little diagram that I crudely sketched out, I had another document which explained who these characters were and what their deal was. And the game, what it says is, in Technoir, is if a character is important, give them 3 adjectives. If they're less important, give them 2. and if they're unimportant, give them 1, because everyone gets something. So here are the characters from the game that I ran, that my characters invariably ran into, and this is all the prep I did for them. We have a name. Let's look at the top one. Elgin Farrow. We have a role. He is a merchant. We have an animal. He is a lizard. And then 3 adjectives. He is clinical, authoritative, and ruthless. Now, those 3 adjectives do an awful lot of heavy lifting. And if you look down this list, you will see that, you can pretty much paint your own picture of all of these characters based on the role that they do, the animal that they are, and the 3 adjectives that I've given them. So, and all of these characters got, screen time. All of these characters got significant things to do in the story. They got significant interactions to have with the characters. And this is all the prep I did for them. Like, every single one of them had very little more than this, and I just used this and the way that my characters interacted with them to play out the action. And it just, for me, felt like an incredibly elegant way to get the very most out of very little. And just pick a character on that list and look at them and just imagine what Paisley Winters, a mayoral rival who is a fox, who is charming, stylish, and sneaky, is like. And, your picture in your head might be slightly different to mine. But I think you're probably getting the crux of the character and where you want to take it. Then you fold that in with the diagram that we used, and you've got relationships between all these characters. These are all the characters from that diagram. And you can start to flesh out a living, breathing world populated by believable characters who have desires and drives and things. And, all of those adjectives that apply to those characters are very important to their jobs. Like Bud Kochka, the second one down there, was a harbour master, and his storyline was essentially there was the Steve doors that he employed were all kind of. I basically ripped off season 2 of The Wire for this, but with animals. Imagine season 2 of The Wire, but with muskrats, and that's what happened. Essentially, he was kind of protecting his union interests and kind of being very, very, very kind of like stubborn in the face of outside pressures that he could not compete with, but he was standing up for what he thought was right. And for me, it felt like this was all I needed, and never felt like I was doing too much work. And I felt like if I did want to add anything else, I could. I have used this before, I have used this since, and I have used it in when I started session 0 of my Starforge campaign, and I started talking about the connections to some of the NPCs in the game. I did give them adjectives that weren't from the Starforged character creation tools, just to give them, and I didn't share them. It's not on the show, you'll see. It's just kind of in my brain and in my Google Docs, just to give me something that I can always fall back on, that I know them because they've got these 3 things about them. Does this seem like too little for you, Steve, or is this something that gives you enough to jump off of, or would you always want more in this instance?
No, this is perfect for me. I mean, I feel like this is that like minimal amount of information necessary for me to run these NPCs. And I think you're absolutely right. Like my representation of these adjectives is going to be different than what yours would be. And that's part of the fun of the game, is getting to play with different people who have different life experience, different creative interests, and who are going to represent those things differently. But I think that this is a great starting point. I think one of the cool things with doing something this way, kind of like we talked about earlier, is that there's not too much information here, but as you play the game, as things come up in the sessions of play, you can add on to this with more notes. You could even take away an adjective and add an adjective if something dramatic happens to the character, to the NPC, to change how they approach things. And you're still, you're still keeping the basics of this method of generation, but you can always add on to it. And now, like, looking at the sheet like this, it would be interesting to just draw a line through Bud Kochka's brave adjective, and then right in next to it, fearful, as like what happened. And you're not erasing the one adjective, but you are indicating that something happened to change the course of this character's life, and that in and of itself should be interesting, and hopefully it ties into the story and the way that is progressing, so that when you get to the end of a campaign and you look back on these, you can be like, wow, these characters went through some stuff, and their lives changed just as much as hopefully the player characters' lives changed.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting you should say about kind of changing some of this, but the character second from the bottom, Rashida Kwan, who is the starlet, she was a kind of like a jazz singer, I think, in this, who was kind of like a damsel in distress a little bit as a character, and I think that she felt too passive to me and didn't feel interesting enough. So I think I changed whatever she had as her third adjective to smart, because I wanted her to know and understand that she was kind of trapped in this life that she was in, and that she wanted more, but the forces around her were too powerful for her to kind of get out of, because otherwise she just became a nothing character who didn't really have much interest about her. The same as, like, we run into thugs and gangsters all the time in our games, and they are so rarely anything other than a bag of hit points. But the one at the bottom there, like, to make the word impulsive on top of the thug, it not only gives them a little bit more character, but it gives them a drive that kind of governs what they do in, like, a combat encounter. If that's how you're going to go down with it, then someone who is impulsive in a combat encounter is much more interesting as someone who is, or is very different to someone who is calculating in a combat encounter, or someone who is reserved or frantic or frenzied or whatever. So these are things that inform other parts of games other than just you knowing what the character's like. It can actually, if you drop Aki into a combat encounter, you know exactly what he's going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think is the whole point. Like, you have all the information you need right here, and you don't have to leaf through pages of backstory and all of these different things. Just a couple words speak multitudes.
Yeah, and I recently had a very depressing lunch with a friend of mine who was like, slipped down the AI rabbit hole, and he was like, "Oh, a friend of mine is working on an NPC generator for D&D. Do you want to have a go on it?" So I was like, "Sure, why not? I'll humor this." And he said, all you need to do is you need to put in a descriptor of a character. So, put in like brave or courageous or whatever. So I put in the word drunk. And what I got was, somewhat unsurprisingly, depressingly so, was a character that was a flame-haired Irishman. And their name was like kind of Drunky O'Malley or something like this. And it had like 2 pages of backstory about their upbringing and stuff, and I was like, A, this is problematic. I can see some real issues with this. B, who needs this much information about an NPC? Who needs this much information about a PC? Um, and see, think of it yourself. Get this out of my sight. That's that was it was just kind of like, what are we doing here? Like, this is just nonsense. And I think that this is a conversation for another day, because I'm seeing so many conversations about AI, and especially
Yeah.
solo gaming.
Yeah.
And AI is a tool that has uses in a lot of things. I'm finding weird. A lot of people that I've run into who are like, hear me out, like AI is actually good, and then they've actually explained an actual good tech use for it. You're like, oh, okay, that is actually, that makes sense. It's when it's
Yeah.
like, I need to use it to do something creative because I'm a not creative person. Whether or not we can get into an argument about AI being an accessibility tool for people who have no creative drive is another story, another time, and we'll probably have to do that next year. We'll have to build up to that. But I think what I proved was comprehensively by this one search that AI is both racist and useless. So there we go.
Or also, you could just take that one word that you typed in and just build an NPC off of that without having to have pages upon pages of backstory. Just, maybe add one more adjective on top of that: drunk and graceful. That
Ooh,
sounds interesting.
that does sound interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, who's a favorite NPC you've ever come up with, Steve?
Ever? Oh,
Yeah.
boy. I've come up with a fair few. Um,
I mean, it can even be like your favorite NPC you've ever run into.
so I think that I have a couple of different answers for this.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the most memorable NPC I have ever come up with was in a game that I was running about 5 years ago. And it was a contact that one of the player characters had. And I'll be honest, I was about 4 scotch and sodas into the night. Um, so I performed this incredibly high-pitched, incredibly fast-talking character that had the entire table in stitches, and I have never been able to replicate it since. And so we would continue to play. We continue to play that campaign for another year or so, and every time they would try to like contact that contact, I'd be like, friends, this is not going to be as funny or as memorable as that first time. But I'll give it the old college try. And
You should
so
have said
that was,
they died on the way back to their home planet, is what I'd have
yeah,
said.
yeah, yeah. I think the first couple times I was like, you can't get a hold of them. And then I was like, I don't want to keep you from getting this contact that is on your character sheet. So it's a useful mechanical thing that I don't want to take away from you, but also I need to be apparently in a very particular state of mind in order to bring that out.
Four scotch and sodas.
4 scotch and sodas. One of maybe memorable for me, but it was the NPC that taught me the lesson that no matter what you do, your players will mess around with your NPCs.
Mm-hmm.
And I had this like old wizard that I had named Egglemoth, and
Solid name.
he was a very serious character. It was a fairly serious campaign, and the players called him Egglemuffin for the entire campaign, and that has never left me. Probably 10 years on. As far as like, if I have to pick in recent years my favorite NPC that I've ever created, I really love Merrick from my second season.
Mm-hmm.
The brewer who is friends with my main character in that season, Ben. He was just like, he was a friendly dude. He was a brewer. He stood up for things, and I felt like there were a couple of scenes between him and Ben that really really played with the idea of how do you be a mercenary in this world and not do terrible things, and how do you live with that? And there was this, to me, very sort of tragic breaking of their friendship that occurred, and I tried a couple of times to repair that friendship, but the way that the story went, like they never came back together, quote unquote, on screen
Mm.
to restore that friendship. And when I think about the continuing story of the Crest and of Ben, I don't know if he and Merrick will ever find that friendship again. And so it's like it's a very sad thing to me, but also it's an experience that I felt very viscerally,
Mm-hmm.
because I've, maybe not that specific situation, but I've been a part of friendships that have fallen apart, and felt that longing of, hey, I miss that person. I wish I could go back to that time when we were friends, but circumstances, life, whatever, have conspired to make that not happen.
Mm.
And so that is probably the NPC that has meant the most to me in the last couple of years. And I would be remiss if I didn't shout out Adelie from the first season.
Yeah.
She was probably, she was definitely my favorite NPC in the first season. That one's kind of cheating because she went from an incidental interaction to a companion to kind of a PC
Mm.
through the course of that season. So I don't know if she counts as an NPC for this.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
How about for you?
my favorite was a character that my group will not remember the name of, but in the Dungeon World campaign I ran, I had to keep adding competent people to the party to keep them alive. In the in the first episode, they had this like elven scout who was basically there to provide some information about the threat at hand, but ended up getting involved in every single combat because they were so bad at fighting that outside of a very few occasions, they needed this character to bail them out. And this character, who's kind of like an aloof woodland kind of denizen, just kept cropping up because they were elvish, and they could do that or whatever. But I think there was a moment quite late on where they were arriving at this big city, and they ran into another character that I'd rolled up as a kind of like an incidental character who was a teenage girl called Palu, and she was carrying on her back an architect's tube, like that you'd keep blueprints in or whatever. And they got into such bother with some local trouble that I ended up saying that, she has a really interesting sword in there. And I came up with on the fly that this sword was this kind of weird clockwork device that when she twisted the handle could become a grappling hook, could become a mace, could become a morning star, could become a sword. And from that point on, she became the Swiss Army knife of the party. She just tagged along, and no one at any point said, why is she coming with us? It was because, can we bring her with us? Because we're going to die the next time we try and fight anyone. And I managed to use her in a way that she didn't just come in and kill whatever they were up against, but she used her wiles and her her skills as a fighter to in some way change or the odds favorably for them. And it was kind of vital. And I think there was a point where she fell off a waterfall fighting a bone giant, and as you do. And
As you do.
I remember my players being like, we've got to save Palu. And I was just like, oh, it's working. Or you're thinking you're not getting out of this without her. So it was one of those two things. But yeah, that was
either way, she was important to them.
She was
whether it was because they cared about the character or because they just wanted the the loot.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, NPCs, very important. Treat them with respect.
They're pretty cool.
And you can do some really fun things with them, and you can do some interesting things with them if you think about them as narrative devices and tools to make you tell a better story. And NPCs are an important part of world building, and that's why we talked about this one off the back of the last episode.
Absolutely.
We're not 100% sure what we're going to talk about next time, but we think we've got a couple of ideas. But until then, that's us, right? We're done.
That's us.
Cool. See you later, guys. Bye.
See ya.